everybody, and welcome to part 3 of the Product Kickstart Masterclass, hosted by CONNECTpreneur and Modus Create. Modus Create is a leading digital transformation and consulting company based in the Washington, D.C. region with international delivery operations. They serve some of the biggest brands in the world, as well as early stage, venture-backed, and pre-seed companies. They've done a great job for 3 of my portfolio companies, and it's a real joy to be working with this team. They've done a great job with the first 2 parts of the masterclass. Hopefully you have found it very valuable. We will put the links in for part 1 and part 2. They are on our YouTube channel, the CONNECTpreneur YouTube channel, so they're easily findable. And today, the class will be led by JD Jones, who is with Modus, who I'll introduce very briefly. Also on the call is David Fitzpatrick, who is the head of marketing and business development for Modus Create. This is sort of an invite-only thing that we do for our alumni and special guests. It's something that we've found to be very valuable for the community. Obviously, this is a very hot topic. So many lessons to be learned. So many mistakes have been made, myself included. I have a few stories. And what the Modus guys have done is create a really interesting and relevant program that helps guys like us that are in the software development or any product development, frankly, world to minimize risk and maximize the chances for success. And I just also want to say that this class is not just for software and technology products. It's for any products. If you actually look at the principles that they're teaching, it can be applied to any product, whether you're making, a glass or a pen or whatever. These principles all are pretty timeless. So very interesting stuff. I'm going to now introduce JD. JD, if you could introduce yourself and your team, and thank you so much for doing this. And go ahead and take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Tien. Hello, everyone. Thanks again for having us back and, giving us the opportunity to hopefully teach you a little something about Product Kickstart. I'm JD Jones. I'm the Director of User Experience at Modus Create. And I've been with Modus about 8 years, and I've been working on this Kickstart program for almost all of those 8 years, just refining it over time. Kickstart, if you're not familiar with that, that's really what we're going to be talking about today. It's a collection of workshops that we run to really make sure teams are on the same page, help them find that sweet spot for their product around like what are the right features to build to really make the biggest impact on the users for that product. I'm also joined by David Fitzpatrick, who is our Director of Marketing. And we've also got a few other folks from Modus listening in who are also involved in the whole Kickstart program at Modus. So just to go over the agenda, the plan for today, I'm going to recap the last 2 sessions just really quickly, just to kind of set our bearings for what we covered in the past 2 sessions. As Tien mentioned, though, if you did miss those first 2, recordings are available. They're in the Zoom chat. They're on the CONNECTpreneur Slack. They're on YouTube. So most of the stuff should be pretty clear, even without seeing those recordings. But I think it would be helpful to go back and watch those. So in the last 2 sessions, we discussed, workshops that we run as part of Kickstarts. Today, we're going to be focusing mostly on how do we take those workshops and put them into practice? How do we actually get value out of them? Ground rules wise, if you have any questions as we go through, please feel free to put them in the chat. And then at the end, we're going to reserve time to go back, and Skylar's going to help us make sure that we're answering those questions that are in the chat. All right. So with no further ado, let's get into the content. So as I mentioned real quick, I just want to recap the workshops that we covered in the first session. Each of these workshops is really designed to answer specific questions, right? So we have 2 different personas workshops, and the point of those is to really identify, what are my users' needs? Then we go to journey mapping, in which we visualize which of those needs are the most painful. From there, with goal alignment, which is our next workshop, we're discussing what success means for the business and creating some actual objective, measurable business metrics to track. Cover story is where we make a pretty clear transition from like the problem space. So when we're doing personas and goal alignment, we're very much in the problem space. With cover story, we're transitioning into the solution space. How are we actually going to solve those problems now? In the cover story session, we start to envision what our product and business will look like 2 to 5 years from now. And then from there, we're just getting gradually more specific about the solution itself. So with Creative Matrix, that's a brainstorming exercise where we're generating ideas for, how can we deliver on that vision that we defined, and how can we meet the user needs that we define in our personas workshop? So you can start to see everything is starting to tie together here. Then we get into what we call user story mapping. It's a fancy name, but really it's just we're defining specific features that we'll be building for the product. Again, using all the info from the previous sessions with prioritization in mind, right? We want to be able to prioritize which features are most valuable to the business and to our users, and based on that, which of those will we release first, right? And then getting more specific in Design Studio, we're getting into actually sketching out what the screens will look like, if you are building a software product. If it's something else, maybe you're sketching out like what the physical product looks like or what the service looks like. And then next, now that we have a pretty good understanding of like what the product is, we circle back to really defining what success means. And we're going to define engagement metrics that we can track, right? So like how much are people actually using the product? And those engagement metrics help us predict if we're going to meet those business goals that we defined in our goal alignment session back in the beginning. And then the last session we have is research planning. So during all of these workshops, right, we're noting down assumptions, we're noting down open questions, because those come up inevitably. In research planning, we prioritize which of those questions we want to focus on answering first. So, good slate of workshops there, a lot of thinking, a lot of work gets done. So, you've done all these workshops. Today, we're going to be talking about, where do you go from here? How do you take the outputs from the workshop and put them into action and actually start, designing, researching, and building out a product? And the last time we met, we talked about how the workshops really are just the tip of the iceberg. They're not the end-all, be-all of product design or development. They're really a great way to get your team on the same page, gather different perspectives, ideas from people, make fast decisions. But there's a lot of work to do from here, right? So after the workshops, we spend a week or two parallel tracking a handful of different initiatives. And we'll be walking through some of these things in more detail today, going into some tips on how to actually perform these activities. I say some because last time we did cover prototyping and testing, as well as business and product KPIs. So today we're going to be focusing on the rest of the activities. But again, if you want more info on those others, you can go back to the last session's recording. And then, even after that, right, you're not going to have a product probably in just like 4 weeks or 6 weeks. So after this, 1 to 2 weeks of kind of deliverable preparation, we move into what we call sprint zero. And here we're again parallel tracking a few things. And this is where you're really kicking off like the start of building the product. So, we're not just building though, we're also taking our research plan, executing on it, answering those risky questions. We're also looking at the features with the least unknowns and starting to design those because there's not much risk there. So like, for example, pretty much every product is going to have a login screen, right? When we're talking software. So we can probably start designing that without doing much research on it. And then meanwhile, our developers are kind of getting their environment set up, learning about the code base. Project managers are getting their stories, user stories and requirements pulled into like a tool like Jira, something like that. So that's kind of high level lay of the land. Again, what I mentioned is we're going to be focusing on, everything happening in that 1 to 2 weeks post the workshops. So one of those things is research planning. We discussed that a little bit, right? So during that workshop, essentially what we do is we take all of the assumptions and unknowns we've collected throughout all the other workshops, and then we prioritize them. So you have this list of assumptions and unknowns. What do you do with them, right? Well, what we want to do is we want to test our assumptions and answer those unknown questions. In fact, that's really what research is, right? You have a question you don't know the answer to. You pick a research method to answer the question, and then you analyze the data that you get so that you get the answer, essentially. Often, I think when people hear research, they immediately think either interviews or surveys, but there are actually many, many more research methods out there that could better fit your needs. So, we have a lot of leave behinds in this deck that we're going to share out with you afterwards. We have linked to here an article that I go back to time and time again that can just give you like some really great guidance on which research methods to choose given the question that you're trying to answer, the constraints that you have, etc. The other thing I'd like to talk about is what we call an experiment, right? An experiment is a specific type of research method. Experiments can be great for testing an assumption at scale, right? And what I mean by at scale is like, it's not really enough to just know that like some people find your product valuable. You need to know that there's like a sizable market there for your product. So like sometimes, we'll go out and do interviews with like 10 people just to get some qualitative understanding around why they find the product valuable or why they don't. But with experiments, you can now do something similar, not as deep, but you can start to test your assumptions with hundreds of people, thousands even, depending on how much, budget you want to put into it. So if you remember, Modus actually worked on an internal app. It was a farmer's market app that we put through this Kickstart process. You've seen a lot of examples for it in the previous slides. For that app, one of our biggest assumptions is that people will enjoy the convenience of shopping at the farmer's market from their home, like on their phone, rather than going in person, right? Now, if you think about it, though, we recognize there that there's a real risk. There's a real big assumption there that, the draw of a farmer's market could be that in-person atmosphere, right? That could be like what people really like about it. So, that's our assumption. To test that, just giving you an example, we could run a landing page test, or what you may have heard referred to as a smoke screen test. And this is where basically you launch a simple landing page, a website, explaining your product's value proposition, right? So explaining the farmer's market app, how it benefits the users, right? And then you do some paid ads to drive traffic to it. using Google AdWords or Facebook, whatever it is. And then the key is you measure what percentage of people take some action on that landing page, right? They're either going to give you their email, or maybe there's like one step of the flow that you want them to do. And if a high percentage of people take the action, then you can be more certain that you're solving a problem that people actually care about, right? Versus if you've got 10,000 visitors to that site and only 0.5% of them are filling out your form, then it might be time for you to think about pivoting to a separate problem or a different problem to solve. So that's kind of like the most basic form of this experiment. Another leave behind that we have here is we've included some links here to show you other examples of experiments. Circling back to research in general for a second, I do want to throw out a word of caution. It's so important that you recruit the right participants for your research. So what do I mean by right? First, you have to find the right number of people, right? There's definitely this kind of growing misconception in the world of product that no matter what type of research you're doing, you just need 5 to 8 participants or test subjects, and that's enough. And that rule does apply, I think, to usability testing. Usability testing specifically is we're just asking people to try the app and seeing if they run into usability issues. And we say 5 to 8 participants because the thought is, and it's not a thought, it was kind of empirically measured. After 8 participants, you start to uncover the same usability issues over and over again. So it was kind of like a return on investment decision. You could keep paying people to do your usability testing sessions and spending time on it. You're just going to start finding less and less things, right? So while that concept applies to usability testing, it does not apply to exploratory research, where you're really trying to understand your customers' needs, right? Which is, in our opinion, the more valuable type of research, right? That's where you're going to uncover these competitive advantages that are going to set your product apart from the competitors' products. So for that type of research, what you need to do is you need to look at and define the different roles in your product, right? And recruit 8 to 12 participants from each role as a starting point. So bringing it back to our marketplace app, we had sellers and we had buyers as our 2 roles. Pretty straightforward, right? It's a marketplace. But then, so with that, right, we would be looking at 8 to 12 from each role, 8 to 12 participants. So, 16 to 24 participants that we want to do research. But then, it gets a little bit more complex in that we look at different characteristics for each role and think about which of those characteristics are most likely to change someone's behavior and change the way they would actually use this product that we're building. So as an example, for sellers, we suspected that small hobbyist sellers would behave differently than more established sellers, right? If I'm just a guy who kind of makes some honey in my kitchen and I want to try to sell it, that's different than if I've already got a line of honey that I'm selling out of mom and pop shops, right? So now, instead of just that 16 to 24 participants, we need to talk to both hobbyist sellers and established sellers. So now when we're talking to sellers, it's not just 8 to 12, now it's 16 to 20 to make sure we cover both sides of that equation. And last, I can't stress enough the importance of doing research with representative users. This is something we see a lot of companies, making mistakes time and time again. They want to test with their internal employees, right? Sort of as a proxy. But in most cases, your internal employees are not going to be representative users. They're going to have experiences, perspectives, and knowledge that will 100% skew your research data, which is dangerous because that can potentially lead you down the wrong path, right? And you can waste a lot of money, a lot of time. So, if that all sounds a little complicated, that's because it is. Research is a specialized field. There's definitely a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And the risk of doing it wrong is high, right? Because essentially you can just end up confirming your own biases. And, the point of research is really to be looking at the problem space from a new perspective, right? And trying to uncover things that you don't already know, right? So that's why we recommend working with a research professional who's trained to remove those biases from the research process as much as possible. And there really is an art to doing that. So that was research planning and kind of how you can put that into action. Next, we're going to talk about vision statement, which is just another deliverable that comes out of a Kickstart. So I'm going to, again, bring it back to our farmers market Kickstart and walk you through an example. So this is the vision statement that we came up with for our farmers market app. Fresh, sustainable produce, anytime, anywhere. Really, really simple, really straight to the point, and then we get into some more details. So we're helping farmers grow and scale their businesses to stay competitive against large distributors, like Whole Foods. We're helping aspiring sellers turn their hobby into a business, and we're enabling farmers to sell directly to local customers via multiple channels. So that's what we mean when we're talking about a vision statement. Bringing it back to our workshops, right? The cover story workshop is going to be your main input into the vision statement. So like, how do you go from the cover story workshop output to crafting this buttoned up vision statement? Basically, in the cover story workshop, everyone writes a cover story, right? They think about, okay, if my product or business is successful, what does it look like in 2 to 5 years? And then they write, like a magazine article and design a cover of a magazine, assuming that their product was so successful they landed on the cover of this magazine. You take all of those cover stories and you look for the common themes that emerged out of them. Common themes around, what makes this business unique? What value is it actually delivering for customers? Things like that. And then you take those themes and you draft, your 2 to 5 year vision statement. And it's, one thing that we talk about a lot is like, it's important to make it concise, because the more concise it is, the more memorable it is, and the more people can share it and be inspired, right? Like you don't want it to be like this, monolithic thing that no one can really remember. So going back to our example, right? We had this really short one-liner at the top, right, that anyone could remember. Fresh, sustainable produce, anytime, anywhere. And then we followed it up with more details. So the beauty of that is like, you've got your 10-second elevator pitch that you can give to people working at your company. You can give it to customers, stakeholders, whoever it is. And the way that we make it concise is we're ruthlessly cutting out words and we're reworking the syntax until the sentence is as short as possible. And this really is where details matter, right? And as Ernest Hemingway put it, cut out the ornamentation, boil it down to the bare essentials, right? And another leave behind tip, we've got a link here to a tool that I use a lot. It's called Hemmingway Editor. It'll just help you really tighten up, your wording, make sure your sentences aren't too long, um, and help you just, like I said, ruthlessly cut out those words until it's like really clear what your vision statement is. Okay, so that was vision statement. Next, I want to talk about personas and journey maps. So the inputs here are pretty obvious, right? You'll work with the data from the journey mapping and persona workshops, right? So the process here is very similar. You'll again want to find themes on the journey map and distill them down into a visual map. It often makes sense to work with a designer here so that they can put the journey map into a visual format that makes it easier for your audience to understand. And your audience again can be people internally at your company. It can be customers, whoever you want to kind of show this map to. With personas, the good thing there is like they're pretty much ready to go after the workshop is complete. Especially if you're doing proto-personas, which again, the difference between proto-personas and real personas is that a proto-persona is kind of based on your experience and your assumptions. It's not really based on actual research data gathered from end users. So basically what we do with those personas is we take the data from the Miro boards in the workshop and we turn them into like a nicer deliverable. And we polish them up a little bit so that we can share them out and refer back to them throughout the process. The only thing you really need to do is see if any of the personas from the workshop could be combined, right? Like a lot of times in that workshop, you'll end up, different people will do personas that look the same and have like very similar goals and obstacles, pain points, etc. In which case, it doesn't really make sense to keep those as two separate personas. You want to look at, okay, can these be combined into one? So, if you do see two personas that have similar goals, obstacles, definitely consider combining them and then, taking that, putting it into like a more just visually appealing, artifact that you can share out. So all that said, like the most important point that I want to make about personas and journey maps is that they're never done, right? I think there's definitely this thought that like, okay, I've got my personas, I'm just going to use these now, and I'm never going to update them. But in the life cycle of product development, right, we talked about how we're parallel tracking research at the same time as designing and building, right? As we're doing that research throughout the process and answering, more and more questions, we're going to be learning new things about who our users are. And those new things need to be fed back into the personas and the journey maps, right? So, just like your product, you should update your personas and journey maps over time. Just like with your business and product KPIs, these documents should really guide all of your decisions making moving forward, right? Someone really needs to spearhead referring back to the personas and the journey maps in your conversations. Otherwise, to be frank, they just become worthless, right? If you do a persona exercise and those personas just like sit in digital space somewhere and you never go back and look at them, what's the point? What's the point of doing them? Like the point of a persona is so that you can make a design decision around, maybe you're trying to prioritize which feature to build first. Or maybe you're thinking about like, what words should I write on the screen, right? Like personas can affect that, the copy on the screen. So, there's this company, IDEO or IDEO, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, it might be IDEO, where they're kind of like widely credited with like being the fathers of design thinking, which isn't true, but they very much did, like, they were very active in the movement of design thinking when it first started out. And they will literally, what they do is they'll print out like life-size cardboard cutouts of pictures of their personas and put them in their meeting rooms so that it's like that person is present whenever they're discussing their designs. So they can point to that, like point back to that person and say, hey, this idea that we're talking about, I'm not sure, how our persona Henry would think about that. Let's go back to, what do we know about Henry? Is he really going to be for this idea? So that was personas. The last thing I want to talk a bit about is competitive analysis, and then we'll open it up for questions. So you've probably all done some form of competitive analysis in the past. Often when we're doing these, we're doing two things. We're trying to see if there's a gap in the market that our product can fill, that other products don't fill. And a lot of times we're just looking for inspiration. And those things are definitely great to do. They're very valuable exercises. But we argue that we need to take that first point a step further, right? It's not just about identifying if there is a gap, but we have to be thinking about the cost of switching from whatever the incumbent solution is, right? In most cases, there's something that already exists that's either like partially or fully solving the problem that the user has. If you've ever heard of Julie Zhu, she's the former VP of design at Facebook. She posted this really great thread on Twitter recently that just like explained this concept perfectly. And that's linked here. The question we really need to answer is your product better enough that it will convince someone to switch, right? Better enough, right? It's not just like, is there a gap here? You can fill a gap, but if the cost to switch is high, then it may not get, the response that you expect. So Julie, she basically pointed out the relationship between how much better your product is and the cost of switching is not a linear relationship, right? If your switching cost is low, right, you can maybe get away with like a 50% better product, just putting like an arbitrary number on it. So like the example she gave is like with rideshare apps, right? Like if you're trying to use Uber and it's not working, right, and you can't get a ride, the cost for you to just switch to Lyft and then try to get a ride there is super low. So that's good news for Lyft, right? If the switching cost is high, your product might need to be like 2 or 3 times better than the other product to really convince people to switch to it, right? So like if you look at like enterprise systems, it's so painful for companies to switch from one enterprise system to another, especially these like legacy systems that they've been using for 20 or 30 years, right? They've got all their data in there. There's all these complex processes that they're using to like support those legacy products. So, switching is a huge undertaking. So you've got to provide them a lot of value, right, to convince them to do that. So like that's kind of the lens that we need to be looking through when we're talking about competitive analysis, right? It's not just doing like a feature matrix to see what features do we offer that our competitors don't, right? So all of this sort of brings us full circle back to our research plan. It's very risky for, you and your team to look at the competitors alone and make a judgment call about whether your product is better, right? Because it's, let's be honest, it's going to be difficult for you to not be biased about that question, right? By talking to real users and doing surveys, interviews, experiments, you know, you're going to understand their pain points, and you're going to understand the impact that those pain points have on their lives. And through that, you can understand just how painful the existing experience is. And then by showing them your solution and getting their feedback, you also get a sense of how much better your product is, right? So this is where the research is really going to supplement your competitive analysis, right? It's all tied up. It's all tied together. I mean, you can even ask them, like, if you did have to switch to a new product, what would that entail for you? So you can understand the cost of switching, and maybe even design features to make it easier, right? All right. So that is where we are going to stop today. I'd love to take a chance and take questions. It seems like we have a few in the chat here. So maybe I'll take a look at the first one here from Sean. So he says, what advice do you have if your initial research was done for a B2C segment, but pivoted to B2B because it decreased friction within revenue modeling and usability, but the current social following consists of a mix between both segments? Okay, so started with B2C, pivoted to B2B. So is the question like, can you apply the initial research to the B2B space? I don't know if Sean is still on, if he can respond.
Yeah, sorry about that, I was muted.
No worries.
So we absolutely can. I think there's a little bit of an issue in terms of the way we'd be scaling. Because we'd be sort of like switching the payment methods, and we'd be looking at sort of a couple of time lags with that. But we've done a sizable amount of B2B follow-up, and it's definitely applicable in that regard. So yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, my recommendation there would be, again, just thinking back to, okay, we've pivoted to the B2B segment, right? In my mind, that usually means that you're, trying to tackle a slightly different problem, right? Than you were when you were working with B2C. And as a result, you have to think about, what are the assumptions underlying this problem? What are the open questions that I have? And anything new there, it just becomes sort of a business decision around, how risky is this assumption? How risky are these open questions? And prioritizing them and figuring out which ones do we need to answer first, right? There might be some questions you've answered from your B2C research that kind of carry over, that can give you some insights, but my guess would be there's probably some new stuff that you probably need to go and investigate. Is that fair to say? Do you feel like that's accurate, or any follow-up questions there?
I mean, kind of. I think that, we've done enough follow-up in both regards, so like we kind of know what we need to sort of build out, and sort of what, each respective segment is interested in.
Mm-hmm.
I think at this point it's more of an issue of like, the front end, like UI UX, is probably more designed for the B2C segment. So like I could get into more details, but I think that your feedback was applicable, and I appreciate that. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if it's more about evaluating the solution instead of understanding needs, it's as simple as like getting it in front of some B2B customers, right? And seeing how they react to the existing product and the content and the design, right?
Yeah, we're actually going to be sending out a lot of the builds for like more extensive B2B feedback.
Nice.
I think one of the interesting things is like at this point, I think that, the B2B customers were far more interested in like sort of the actual, results than they were any kind of problem in particular. Just sort of like made things a little bit less friction. So, yeah.
Cool. Very cool. All right. Let's see, any other question? We have another message here. Okay, so we have for me, research has validated my value proposition with the end users. And as we prepare for FDA, the research is everything to have a working, viable product. Okay, awesome. That's good. And then from Charles, your statement about using internal versus outside folks for research is not entirely true. If you can find employees not involved in the project, experience indicates that the results are almost identical as outside folks. But research with many customers with a potential interest are much more valuable. I mean, I'm going to have to just disagree on that one. Sorry. It really depends, right? Like maybe if you're building a tool for internal employees, right, then they can give you the feedback that you need. But if not, like it's all about like, is this the type of person that we're targeting with this product, right? That's the type of person you need to be doing research with. If in your experience you're finding that the results are almost identical, I would say there is a potential there that the results are biased, right? That's the whole point of like why we don't do the internal research with internal employees. So just something to think about there.
Got it. Thanks so much, JD, for the presentation. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can just speak up and unmute. Either is okay. I think we've hit the end of the questions so far, but we'll leave it open for a minute.
I've got a question. Can you talk about some time where you've worked with a customer who's done all of this work on planning their approach for their product, you know, and then just a late term entrant competitor came in and really upended their business?
Yeah. I don't know that I've worked on a project specifically like that, where, so you're saying basically we're doing all this work and then we find out about a competitor who enters the market and, you know, is just doing something completely different than what we're doing.
Yeah, right? or something where somebody who has a lot of power in the market decides to get into it, and the decisions that they make run counter to the decisions that you've made in a way that will obsolete a lot of work that you've done.
Yeah. I unfortunately can't say that I've worked on a project like that. I think, you know, just off the top of my head, it still comes back to like, I really believe that if you understand the users better than the competitors, it's less likely that that's going to happen, right? Like, it's all about finding that space where you can offer value that where the competitors aren't. Now, obviously, like, it's not like every competitor is going to like publish their roadmap publicly, and you're not going to know exactly what they're doing. So yeah, I mean, that can be a bummer, but really, I think the point of this entire process is, you know, making sure that the solutions you come up with are differentiated and they're not easy to copy, right? Like that's really the point of innovation. Is like, it's not just about providing new value to a customer. It's about providing something that's not going to be easy for another company to come in and just, you know, copy in a week, right? Like if you look at, I'm blanking on the name, I have it on my phone. The app where you basically go in and like, it's like impromptu conversations, Clubhouse. You know, that was like super easy for Twitter to just spin up that exact feature in like a month, right? So that's, you know, that's another thing to be thinking about when it comes to like your business and your business model. Like, how easy is it for someone to just come in and just do this if they have, the resources like a company that Twitter does.
Hey, JD, something I was going to say from our perspective too at Modus, we've seen is not external, but sometimes internal senior stakeholders entering the process late, right? So you may be able to expound on it better than me, but that's why the stuff that you covered in session 1 on driving alignment is so critical too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Like, that is another thing that can totally derail a project. If you have a decision maker at your company who should be involved in the process, but they're not able to because of time commitments or whatever, that can be a big risk, right? So, we'll often do, you've probably heard of like a RACI matrix where we're defining like, who's responsible for the work versus like who just needs to be informed about the work, right? So those like high level stakeholders, it can just be a matter of like shooting them a quick video or like a quick summary of like the decisions you've made to make sure that they're on the same page as you, so that in the 11th hour they don't swoop in and say, no, this is all wrong, you have to start over.
Is the research into your competitor something that needs to be something that you do constantly to avoid this risk?
Yeah, for sure. It's like everything else, right? Like, and that's the great thing about the user research as well. Like, through that user research, by doing it continuously, you can be talking to people who use your product. You can be talking to users who use competitors' products, right? And you can constantly be getting basically intel on like what competitors are doing well and what they're not doing well from the user's perspective, right? All of that should just continue ongoing, so that, like, to your point, if you're doing it that way, it's less likely that, this company is going to launch something that you had no idea about. That's just going to like invalidate a lot of the work you did.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, JD. I think we had a couple people unmute when we had questions. Does anyone else have a question, want to unmute themselves?
Well, I just wanted to say, for me, sometimes you want to keep your competitors close and let them know what's going on, because maybe they can not be a competitor, but then be, a partner. And if you bring those partners on, they can possibly do some of the research for you, which kind of validates everything.
Yeah, that's a great point. So
Thanks, Sue.
different way of looking at it.
That's where we're headed. So that's a good thing for us.
Very cool.
Great. Does anyone else have any more questions before we end the meeting? Well, awesome. This has been a great masterclass. Thanks, JD and the team. If anyone would like to reach out to the Modus team, we'll send out a follow-up email, and we'll also send out the link to this masterclass if you'd like to rewatch it. And thank you all for joining today.